It's a strange place, the world of psychics, telepathy, hypnosis, and communications with and from the dead. Far too many Hollywood movies and terrible reality shows have cheapened and commercialized the idea of paranormal activities. But it's even stranger to think that a connection to the world of the dead begins in this very building. Now, weird things have happened in this building. Like in the 1950s, a bizarre family who spoke a strange language actually lived in the front room of this building. Isn't it, Helena? That's another story. But in the late 1840s, a young boy went to school in that front building, which was then called the Windham Academy. That boy would one day go on to become the most famous psychic researcher in the entire world. His name was Thomson Jay Hudson, no P in the Thomson. His biography, what we're able to establish of it, shows that he lived a full life, but it's really merely a sketch of his contribution to the study of the realm beyond life. He was born in 1834, and he went to the Windham schools. Even while he was working on his father's farm, and unfortunately I haven't been able to locate where that farm was, don't have class to go back that far. But even while he was working on his father's farm in his boyhood years, he studied natural philosophy, chemistry, logic, and these were subjects that were far beyond what the Windham schools were teaching at that time. His teacher in those areas was his uncle, who loaned him books and gave him private instruction. His father wanted him to be a minister, but Hudson told his father that he could not preach theological dogmas in which he did not believe, at which point his father disowned him. Hudson left Windham with only the education and the knowledge that he gained here. Working his way through college, he began studying the law, and he passed the bar exam at the age of 23. He opened his own practice in Port Huron, Ohio, where he remained through the end of the Civil War, first as a lawyer and then as a journalist. He never lost his curiosity about the natural world. For example, during an oil boom in the Lake Erie area of Canada around 1860, Hudson spent considerable time researching and exploring the oil fields themselves. He developed a number of devices and processes for working in oil fields that are still used today. He left his law practice for the newspaper field in 1866. Following an unsuccessful run for the United States Senate, he became the editor-in-chief of the Detroit Daily Union, where he was known as a brilliant editorialist. In 1877, he became the Washington correspondent for the Scripps newspapers. Now that is basically the equivalent of being the White House reporter for a national network today. He held that post as the Washington correspondent until he was offered a position in the examining corps of the United States Patent Office in 1880. He remained there for 13 years, rising to the position of principal examiner of the United States Patent Office, in charge of one of the scientific divisions of the Patent Office. Along the way, he received 2 Doctor of Literary Letters degrees, one from St. John's College and the other from Ewing College. And then, according to his biographer, one morning in 1893, Dr. Hudson awoke to find himself famous throughout the English-speaking world. The cause of this fame was the publication of his first book, The Law of Psychic Phenomena. And this is a copy of Hudson's first book. You can buy it on eBay for about $100. Okay? It's not a first edition, but it's close. And this little book became one of the bestsellers of the world in the 1890s, for reasons I'll explain right now. At the time, in the 1890s, a cult religious fervor had swept the world. Its name was Spiritualism. In a nutshell, Spiritualism is a religion that believes that spirits of the dead have the ability to communicate with the living. Anyone can receive messages from the dead, but formal communication sessions called seances were conducted by mediums who had the ability to channel messages from departed spirits. Spiritualism reached its peak in the 1890s. At that point, there were over 8 million declared spiritualists in the United States alone. Think of that now, 8 million. And some very famous people, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and Sir Oliver Lodge, who is known as the father of radio. They were spiritualists. And in fact, let me just take a little side note here. Paulina and I went to England and visited the grave of Arthur Conan Doyle, who is buried outside the church cemetery where his wife went to school. They would not allow his body to be buried inside the fence of the cemetery. So this man was a devoted spiritualist. Now, some of the older folks in here, and there aren't very many of you, okay, but some of the older folks in here might remember that there was a very large spiritualist camp over at Brady Lake, when Brady Lake had an amusement park, and the spiritualists had a very large camp, and a few of their cottages are still over there in Brady Lake. There remains in Kent, where I live, there is an active spiritualist church right across from the post office in Kent. The services there involve receiving messages from beyond. And to show you how they've evolved, they even have a Facebook page, if you would like to go visit that. But in any event, the spiritualist movement fascinated Thomson Jay Hudson, and a search for the truth behind their beliefs motivated the research for that first book. He would spend the rest of his life searching for the reality of extrasensory powers as manifested through psychic phenomena. Now, a pseudoscience also coincided with this cult of spiritualism, and this was the cult of mesmerism. Now, we commonly call mesmerism the same as hypnotism today. They're basically the same thing. There are differences, but without going into too much detail, the scientific study of hypnotism, which has been around for 2,000 years, from ancient Greek sleep temples to Hindu yoga meditation, the study of hypnotism is old, as old as basically going back to the Greeks. But by the 1890s, hypnotism, mesmerism, had evolved into basically a carnival sideshow in which theatrical hypnotists supposedly put ordinary people into trances in which they were able to speak with the dead. Now, hypnosis is real. In fact, I'll bet there's people in here who've been hypnotized. But this alleged communication with the dead is what really interested Thomson Jay Hudson. Now, basic reason why Hudson's first book was such an international success, and by the way, it remains in print today, It's gone through 47 editions, and there aren't a whole lot of books that have stayed in print for 110 years. You can buy them on Amazon. What he called his law of psychic phenomenon can be boiled down to 3 simple sentences. Lena says you can read this. He begins by writing about hypnotism shows in his book. In the first chapter, he writes about hypnotism shows. And he notes similarities between hypnotized subjects and the trances of spiritualist mediums. He evolves a premise that any contact with spirits, whom the spiritualists believed were voices from the dead, his theory was that this contact was in fact contact with the medium's or the subject's own subconscious mind. Anything else, he said, could be explained by telepathy, which he defines as contact between 2 subconsciouses. Now, today, the idea of the subconscious or the subliminal mind is old hat in psychiatry. They use it to explain almost anything that a shrink wants to explain. That is your subconscious mind. The Thomson Jay Hudson from Windham, Ohio, was one of the first people to elaborate the theory and relate it to paranormal activity. Now, his 3 laws of psychic phenomena reads like this, and I'll read the law and then talk about it a little bit. His first law was that man has 2 minds, the objective mind, which is the conscious, and the subjective mind, which is the subconscious. The conscious mind carries on a person's practical, everyday life, and the subjective mind is dormant, but it's like a camera. It records every single moment, every single impression that a person receives throughout their life. Not a single second of that person's life and everything coming in through the 5 senses escapes the subjective mind from birth to death. Now, something that you may be consciously unaware of, like the fact that there's a fan right over your head blowing air down on you. Your conscious mind isn't even thinking about that. But your subconscious mind is recording that sense of touch of the wind passing over you. It's recording it and it's storing it. Point 2, Law 2. The subjective mind is constantly open to control by suggestion. And it's most easily reached in a state of hypnosis. It's most easily reached and manipulated, which is what the theatrical hypnotists of the 1890s would do